The first sound was not the cry of the newborn, but the hard iron rasp of a shackle dragging across splintered planks, a slow, grinding scrape that cut the heat-stunned air of a frontier noon and folded it into a knot inside every chest that heard it. Sun struck the square like a thrown brand. Dust rose in brittle swirls. At the center of the stage, beneath a sky as white-hot as a forge, a girl knelt with blood still tacky on her thighs and a swaddled red-faced infant sinking toward a whimper, the world already pressing in as if to teach him about weight before breath. Faces leaned forward with the same blank interest men give to cattle and guns. The smell of iron, salt, and old wood baked into a single bitter scent. Somewhere a horse stamped and a crow barked like laughter. The girl did not lift her head. She held the newborn close enough to share a heartbeat and pretended the plank beneath her knees was earth, not scaffold. The chain bit deeper for the pretense. Before we begin this journey, if your heart has room for stories of mercy dragged through dust and set on its feet, subscribe for more. What follows will not flinch. Bidding moved like a brush fire, a dry crackle at first and then a hungry run. Leather creaked, coins clacked, boots jostled. A man raised his chin, then another, as if their bodies were the hands they refused to lift, as if want were a posture and not a decision. The numbers climbed, the air thinned. Heat swam and shimmered so that the edges of the stage bent and shimmered, as if the square had been sunk into a river and all were looking down through water at this bent scene. The girl breathed slow, counting the stallion snorts beyond the corral, grounding herself in animal simple truths. The infant hiccuped against her collarbone and then went quiet. A quiet so small she had to bend her thoughts close to hear that he still existed. A figure cut through the crowd without haste, left a straight seam where the bodies parted, spoke a number that broke the rhythm of the heat and sent all sound skittering to the ground. The chain fell. The stage shuddered with the final clank, and in that defeated clang there was the shape of a door opening. Hands did not touch her. A knife kissed the shackle instead. The girl stood on shaking feet, the iron ring already wearing its bruise into history, and followed a stranger out of the square, past the stables, beyond the jeer and the laugh and the lifted hat brim. The town did not follow. The town, like a dog that knows a better whip waits at home, turned away and unlearned the moment even as it happened. The road from the auction drifted into the hard quiet of late summer hills, low cedar and stone baking under the sun. A hawk wheeled, a cottonmouth slid back into its idea of water at the dry creek's shadow. The stranger rode, led, walked, said nothing. Silence can be a wall or a blanket, and this was the second kind. The girl moved inside it, one step after the other, holding the infant like a lantern carried across a ruined house. Her body hurt in the intricate ways of labor and fear layered together, the aches that live in the tendons, the breath that gets caught because the ribs have memory. But at the end of the road there was a cabin with a roof that did not leak. Boards hammered true, a cot that was not the floor, a stove with a heartbeat of ember, and a cradle that waited as if it had been listening all morning. Sleep has to be relearned when terror has educated the body. The first nights were not sleep so much as truce. She watched shadows and learned the new ones by name. She fed the infant and listened for footsteps and heard none that were not her own. Mornings arrived like hands offered in apology. Bread appeared on the doorstep with the quiet ritual of weather. A jar of mashed fruit and a folded cloth worn soft where years had taught it tenderness. A square of embroidery with small bluebirds pecking at nothing and everything along the edges. She touched that cloth and felt the strange weight of being given something that had not been taken first. Her name was said with a pause before it, as if it were a delicate thing half remembered, and the pause did more mending than medicine. Days lengthened into loops of work and breath. Water was drawn, Shirts were hung. The baby's fists found the world and argued with it in little circles. The ranch made sounds she learned and folded into the soft place behind her eyes where safety tries to grow. Wind through wire, the guttural patience of cattle, a kettle's seam of steam. Now and then a whistle drifting as if the air had been taught an old tune and could not help but hum it. She did not ask for anything. Asking had been stolen from her language by men who liked their answers loud. But the stranger's quiet did not demand payment. It was a field left unburned long enough for green to happen by itself. Trust, when it comes after drowning, arrives like weeds, sudden and everywhere, hardy in the cracks. The infant, stronger with each dawn, wore the name she whispered into his hair when no one watched, a name shaped by breath and held where no invoice could reach. Work found her hands and agreed to stay. There are customs that lower like evening and customs that lift like morning. She learned the second. In the windless afternoons, she sat by the doorway and mended, and when dust lifted on the horizon, she braced and did not run. The riders were men who believed paper could make a person a chair, or a rope, or a barn door. The stranger met them with a stillness that felt older than iron and sent them away without smoke. It shook her, not because of the gun, which mostly stayed in its sleep, but because of the sentence he laid down in the dust by standing. Property does not breathe. The wind took that thought and rehearsed it through the grass until it sounded like law. There is a fever that comes when the body decides it may live. It sneaks in like relief and burns like judgment. She fell into it without ceremony. Heat blurred edges and turned time into a misstruck bell that kept ringing. The stranger kept watch, a lamp turned low, moving quietly as if sound could break her. He fed the infant with patient hands and learned the clumsy cradle, the sway that mothers know like a second spine. He dozed against wood, woke against worry, and never allowed the room to feel alone. When she surfaced, she saw the world outlined by the edges of his exhaustion, the ways a face writes truth when sleep has rubbed off the varnish of manner. Gratitude is a dangerous thing when you have been taught it is a debt, but she found a version with no hook and let a little of it settle. Spring had to be earned, and the land delivered it late. When it came with the shy insistence of weeds through fence rails and the incredible stubbornness of river ice deciding to be water again. She learned to mend fence, to read weather off the backs of cattle, to measure days by the swing of light across the doorstep. She did not hide. The infant learned laughter, startled at his own sound, tried it again, became it. Songs returned to her mouth in whispers, then louder in the company of the stove and the silent blessing of clean sheets. The scar around her ankle thinned to a pale ring that could be touched without flinching. It stayed, a white mirror of history, but it no longer dictated where her foot could go. The town, which keeps its own archive of hypocrisies in the shallow pockets of memory, watched. Grocers went quiet when she entered, then loud after she left. Some called her anything but a person inside their heads where they thought words could not be heard. But the ranch said her name without chewing it. A small thing, a revolution disguised as manners. There are countries built on less. The stranger's history arrived in fragments, not told as confession or demand, but simply shared like weather. Loss had made a church in him and lit a candle to someone with his jaw and a girl's braid and a winter that did not forgive. He had measured his days forward from a failure so heavy it bent his shoulders even when his hands were idle. In the telling, something unknotted. The story did not change its ending, but the telling made room for air around it, and air is sometimes what grief wants more than anything. She listened and understood that he did not need rescue any more than she did. Mercy is not a ladder. It is a bench with space for two. Accidents happened with the rude normality of life. A ladder shifted, flesh split, Blood made its quick stinging case for panic. Her hands remembered what the body knows when it has had to heal itself without permission. Water boiled, cloth folded, skin sewn back to skin. The stranger held still in the way strong men can when they decide not to scare anyone. Her concentration washed the scene of anything but the rhythm of stitch and draw, the little blessings tied at the ends. When she wrapped the bandage, both of them pretended the air had not changed color. Later, a note found its way to a plate like a bird to a windowsill. Words do not have to be many to unclench something. Once unclenched, it doesn't close the same way again.
The next visitor did not wear dust like an apology. He wore it like a cologne and had rings that recognized only the flesh they bit. He arrived with the performative certainty of men who believe paper can part seas. A duel learned the dust again. A pistol sang once and then fell silent with the prompt dignity of a finished sermon. The stranger walked away before the town decided who to cheer for. That night the girl bent over boiling water, and her body folded like a kicked gate. The stranger caught her and anchored her to the bed, sat vigil as fever wrote unsteady paragraphs across her skin. His hands had the memory of quiet work in them, and they made a lullaby of care until the fever lost interest and moved on. After that, days braided themselves into a length of living that could be wrapped around shoulders. The house expanded by inches that looked like kindness. One room became two. A cradle became two beds. There are ways a door can open that teach the body new postures. She opened the back room first in her mind, then with nails and borrowed paint. She told no one what she was building because some rooms fall apart when named too soon, and then word carried itself because ache recognizes a light. They came with their mouths closed and their eyes too open, girls who had learned to make themselves invisible even under the noon sun. The back room did not ask them to tell stories before granting sleep. It offered a bed before it offered a question. The house learned to hold multiple breath rhythms without flinching. The stove learned how to be generous. The porch learned how to listen without advice. It happened one dawn when fog split in the yard like a curtain slowly parting to show the ordinary miracle of a fence. A bundle lay by the barn door, cotton torn into a swaddle that had known riverbank mud and the panic of hurried fingers. No note, but the proof of someone's trembling love pressed into the tightness of the wrapping. The bundle voiced itself with a new, angry life sound, and she folded to her knees. There is a way a woman can hold a child who is not hers that makes the earth blink. She did that. She lifted and called warmth to come with the motion. The stranger's breath caught behind her like a saddle cinch, pulled the exact right amount. The kitchen became a sanctuary that night, with dishwater steam and lamplight drawing soft edges around silhouettes that had only known hard borders. In the sound of two children sleeping, a proposal was spoken in the tongue of ordinary doing. Names were offered not as possession, but as shelter. She stood, placed a palm over a heart that had been steady for her since the square, and chose the future as if selecting the next log for the stove. Choice, not rescue. Two words with a road of difference between them. They took that road together. Seasons kept their agreements. The vegetable rows pulled themselves farther into the yard. The barn wore new paint like a healed scar wears sun. A second bunkhouse rose from old pine and older promise, and above its door a sign not carved with flourish, but hammered with care. Rest here. The phrase was a sentence to some and a sentence commuted for others. Some stayed for a week, some for a season, some for the amount of time it takes to remember a name with the weight on it removed. She kept a journal at night, ink pooling in letters shaped by a hand that had learned to be careful, then learned it could be firm. She wrote lines that could be read aloud like prayer, not to a sky, but to a kitchen, to a bed frame, to a door that closed without trapping. Her daughter, born under a calmer star, grew legs that ran and hands that asked. Children read history in scars the way mapmakers read gulches and weather reads open doors. Little fingers were curious, traced the thin, pale ring around an ankle that no longer belonged to iron, and asked the question kids ask when it is safe to be honest. The answer arrived without tremble because the house had taught it to. A lock once thought me a thing. It forgot. I reminded it. The girl nodded with the joy of logic and went back to building a fort from chairs because that is what victory looks like at 5. The land itself, which had watched so many men teach it violence with plow and greed, softened its gaze. Coyotes sang from farther away, as if respectful. Hawks stooped to the fields and left with mice and not with anyone's hope. The wind learned the hymns that the backroom women unknowingly taught it while they shelled beans and told each other small, good stories about days when nothing bad happened. The strange holiness of boredom arrived and stayed for supper and then taught everyone how to play with cards without gambling anything they could not bear to lose. Not everyone who came wanted rest. Some came to collect debt they had made up in order to feel like kings of something more than their own hunger. One came quiet, with law rolled in his pocket like a cigar. He spoke on the porch where the world can eavesdrop and issued terms constructed from paragraphs meant to break spines. The answer he got was not a bullet this time, but a ledger built from milk and flour and the irrefutable math of mouths fed and hands healed. There is a law beyond paper, and some men can hear it if you speak it calmly enough against their ear. He left. The porch kept the indent his boots made right there at the edge of the board for a year, as if even the wood wanted to remember the moment someone folded a threat into silence. Sorrow still knew the address. It came dressed as winter that year, late and mean, stunting corn and killing the stubborn pig that had refused to learn fence. It hung around the eaves and rattled the lungs. A cough took up lodging in the bunkhouse, and the house learned the fever routine again, this time from many, carrying bowls and cloths and small mercies from room to room until the sun remembered its job. When spring finally lifted the gloom, the homestead felt like a chest that had just exhaled after being held underwater. Joy returned louder, not because it had to show off, but because survival makes clatter in the cupboards, and no one complains about that kind of noise. The twist arrived in a letter without signature, the paper thick like someone had wanted their words to feel expensive. The postmark said a city name that tasted like ash in the mouth of anyone who had ever watched a railroad bully a town into being. Inside, a hand that had been taught penmanship by someone who believed in appearances drew an ancestry that pretended to be truth. The letter said the newborn from the square had been born to a woman with a last name that carried weight east of the river, weight measured in folded bills and connections heavy enough to alter law. The boy was now legally entangled in a future none of them had asked for. A distant patriarch, made curious by rumor, had traced threads backward and had decided, with the generosity of the well-fed, to claim what he called legacy. He wanted the child, not the mother. He wanted blood, not breath. He demanded the boy delivered for schooling and shaping and the long, cold work of erasing origins that do not grace a parlor. The letter did not say please. It did not offer kindness. It offered protection with the solvent of erasure. It offered a kind of mercy that ends with forgetting your own name. The homestead felt it like a sudden temperature drop. The room shivered. The women in the back house stood closer without knowing why. The boy, older now, ran among the rows chasing grasshoppers, oblivious to the map being drawn for him by a stranger's ink. The stranger who had bought the girl's sleep put the paper down and stared so long into nothing that the nothing stared back. Choices gathered like thunderheads on the horizon where the highway to town cut its unfriendly line. She remembered the square. She remembered the scraped boards under her knees. She remembered an infant sinking into quiet because the world had pressed too hard too early. She also remembered the lamp on the porch and a man deciding to keep watch rather than make an oath. She remembered the first bowl of oatmeal, the handkerchief with birds stitched into its four corners as if the corners of a life could be protected if only someone would sew enough wings there. She remembered the first bed she ever lay in without hearing footsteps at the threshold. She looked at her daughter at the far fence, hair feral in the sun, mud on her calves, eyes the color of late winter pecans, and understood that memory was now a weapon, not against anyone, but for him. The town learned of the letter, because towns always do. News moves along fences and under doors like a patient animal that can smell meat. Opinions sprouted.
Some counseled compliance with the shrug of people who have never been requisitioned. Others offered guns, as if violence were a universal solvent. She listened to neither chorus. The solution had to be shaped from the same material as the life they had been making, which was not bravado, but stubborn tenderness. She walked the line of the fence in the blue bruise hour before dawn and counted her breaths, counted the posts, counted the places where wire sagged and could be tightened, counted the faces on pillow and pallet in the room she loved, and then she sat on the lowest step with her journal open to a blank page and wrote down a plan so spare that it looked like a prayer. A journey would be needed not to flee, but to claim. The East would have to be met on its own roads, not outshouted from a porch. Evidence would have to be gathered from a world that had never believed women's records mattered. Witnesses who had laughed in the square would have to be found sober enough to say they had seen her chained the day she birthed her child, to swear that she had been sold the way a heifer is sold so that the boy's first certificate of existence would not be the stamp of a rich man's desire. There would need to be a ledger of mercy compiled and bound, pages listing the nights she had walked with him through fever, the hours she had held him through storms, the alphabet he had learned from the hand that had steadied his first pencil. The law might not understand those entries, but a certain kind of judge could be persuaded to look up and see a human before he saw lineage. That would be enough. She began with the back room. The women gathered around the table with its scars and told her the names of cities they never wanted to see but would walk into for her. Travel had its own dangers. The world east of the ridge could be cruel dressed in respectability, and cruelty in fine rooms does damage that dust cannot reveal. But they were made of something frontier weather had tempered. They folded their fear into their blankets, laid it beside their combs, and moved. The stranger set his hat down on the peg, as if surrendering to a truth he had known since the square. The only promises worth making are the ones you are willing to bleed for. The boy slept through the decision, his arm thrown over his eyes, a gesture he had learned from the man who had taught him how to ride without fear. The journey began with a sunrise that looked like a bruise healing, purple giving way to gold. The road bit stone into soles and rattled wagon axles into complaint. Rivers had to be forded that did not care about court dates. Inns had to be endured where men tried to read their shapes and failed. She wore her name like a shield and refused to tuck it away in her pocket where thieves could find it. In courts where chandeliers pretended sunlight, she stood on floors too polished to trust and laid out facts shaped not by rage, but by the quiet geometry of truth. A clerk blinked at the word auction, as if it exposed part of his soul to itself. A registrar found a record with her first name misspelled and corrected it with the careful slowness of a man writing on skin. A midwife remembered through whiskey and tears the blood on the planks and swore to it, her voice gaining strength as if each word were knit from regret and given as penance. In the East, the house of the patriarch was a kind of stage too. Long windows that turned sky into mirrors, rugs thick enough to smother dissent, and a hallway lined with men staring down from paintings as if they could compel outcomes by the weight of their oils. She did not tremble. She walked the length of the hall counting her breath, because breath is the oldest law. The man who had called her boy Legacy waited with the fatigue of a life in which everyone always arrives when summoned. He had a mouth trained to recite generosity as if it were a virtue rather than a hobby. He spoke of duty and future and tutelage and the right kind of loneliness that forges leaders. She answered with the fact that love does not erase origin to make room for destiny. Love writes history in a child's bones and then refuses to let anyone edit it. The man waved a paper like a fan annoyed at heat. He underestimated dust. Dust carries prophecy in places like this. Hearings followed, words piled on words until the air throbbed with them. The stranger stood at her shoulder when rules allowed and outside the door when they did not, hand steady at his side, the scar she had stitched on his forearm, a pale rope around a muscle that never forgot. The boy learned manners in rooms designed to make him forget he ever needed any. He carried a small carved horse in his pocket and rubbed one ear smooth. At night they lodged in houses with stairs that complained under their weight like they were not used to bearing anyone heavy with life. She wrote in her journal by window light and listed every insult the day had tried to feed her, and then wrote its antidote beside it, the little real memories that made a mockery of rich lies. Every page felt like adding a beam to a bridge. The turning point was not a gavel. It was a letter found at the bottom of a drawer in a city office where records went to feel important and be forgotten. It had been written by a foreman with shaky spelling, acknowledging receipt of a flesh warrant the winter before the square. It named the man who had signed for the girl the day she disappeared from the world that called itself civilized. It placed blame where blame had been allowed to wander aimlessly like a stray dog. It made law flinch. Suddenly, a judge who had been instructed by upbringing to ignore certain truths found himself staring at his own daughter's face in the girl's stead and cleared his throat in a way that sounded like apology. The rich man's claim began to tear along the seams because none of his tailors had considered what would happen if the people he ignored ever found their receipts. Victory came in inches. It came as a stamp on a page and a sigh expelled by a room. It came as the lowering of a powerful man's eyes. It came as his son's hand bumping his waist where his arm swung, his fingers unconsciously knitting into the fabric of her dress as if roots had learned to move. They stepped back onto the street together. The gray sky threatened rain like a promise rather than a threat. The stranger tilted his hat against it. The women from the back room, who had come in shifts and pairs and certainty, smiled the tight smiles of those who do not trust good news until it survives a night. They brought bread, as if warding off bad luck. They slept without one boot on for the first time in weeks. Morning entered like a procession of ordinary acts, and in ordinary acts, the sacred lives quite well. Homeward roads never match outward roads. Hills that had seemed indifferent now held themselves a little like welcoming. The river that had driven its cold into their bones offered a gentle ford. The cottonwoods along the bank clapped their big hands together in secular blessing. By the time the ridge appeared with its familiar stitch of fence and the roofline of the bunkhouse and the sign over the door that had weathered and darkened into a thing of dignity, she felt the journey gather itself into story, the kind that would be told softly around tables for years, not to glorify struggle, which needs no help, but to remind the next woman that paper can be made to confess and that distance can be crossed with company. They rode into a quiet that was not emptiness, but anticipation. The yard looked as if it had held its breath for days, and now, seeing them, it could exhale. The goats objected ceremonially from the pen. A flock of blackbirds conducted its sudden unanimous turn into the sky and became an arrow the way birds can, pointing somewhere that felt like an omen. The porch steps creaked in their honest way. She took one, and then another, and then stopped. Because the air changed, because in the odor of dust and animal and wood smoke a new scent threaded in, the kind that lives in cellars and dreams and the seams of bad doors, damp, but not water, mold, but not rot, something off. The door stood ajar by the thickness of a blade. The lamp on the small table flickered with an exaggerated innocence, burning low as if it had been forced to perform calm for too long. The back room was quiet in the wrong way, the way a forest sometimes goes silent when a large thing enters it. Her daughter's small horse had been left on the floor, head at an angle she never abandoned a toy in. The sign over the bunkhouse door, "Rest Here," had a fresh nick in its edge where new iron had glanced wood. The chicken yard gate hung by one hinge. The path to the well wore the story of many fast feet. The journal she always set at the corner of the kitchen shelf lay open and heavy, as if a rough hand had stopped reading and laughed.